He died in Eli's arms, not just as a dog, but as the soul who once stood between chaos and peace. The boy who once couldn't speak now whispered stories into the ears of the old shepherd. Around them stood those who had once lost faith in miracles, now gathered in silent reverence. Ranger didn't pass with a whimper. He passed with purpose, after saving not only a village, but the broken hearts that lived in it. Before we begin this unforgettable story, would you mind sharing where you're from in the comments, and if stories of love, loyalty, and second chances move you? Please give this video a like and consider subscribing. The sea was oddly calm that spring morning, as though the Pacific itself had paused to listen. Whispering Pines, a secluded island off the coast of Oregon, was normally a haven of thick conifer forests, handmade bee boxes, and wind-blown wildflower fields. Yet lately, the buzzing of bees had quieted, replaced by something far less delicate, the low, persistent rustle of scavengers in the underbrush. The previous winter had been unusually warm. The sea ice thinned early, and storms that usually churned the waters around the island had been notably absent. That fragile balance gave way to something the locals could never have foreseen: an invasion. They came at night, raccoons, dozens at first, then hundreds, swam across from the mainland. Drawn by the promise of untended food and unguarded barns, no one knew how they coordinated, but within a month, the effects were undeniable: toppled beehives, torn corn stalks, berry bushes stripped clean, and chicken coops hollowed out to bone and feathers. Harold Collins, 67, stood at the edge of his property, a straw hat pulled low over his sun-scorched forehead. He was a tall, barrel-chested man with a limp in his left leg, earned in a faraway desert during his time with the Marines. His thick gray beard did little to hide the deep lines of frustration carved into his weathered face. Since retiring to Whispering Pines 10 years ago, Harold had served as the unofficial mayor, mediator and problem solver. Now, he looked helplessly at the upturned rows of sweet potatoes in his field, ruined overnight. "They're not scared of us," he muttered to no one in particular. "They're organized." He wasn't wrong. The islanders tried everything: humane traps, noise deterrents, even nighttime patrols, but the raccoons kept coming. Smarter with each countermeasure, the poison didn't work, they learned to avoid it. The traps, they triggered them with sticks. One farmer claimed the creatures were stacking crates to reach his attic. People began meeting at Harold's barn weekly, desperate for ideas. That morning, clouds hung heavy above the island, casting long shadows across the mossy trails. The air smelled of salt and damp pine, and even the gulls were unusually silent. Inside the barn, a group of 15 sat in a loose circle. Among them was Sarah Whitaker, 42, a widow and the island's only beekeeper, tall and lean. She often dressed in worn jeans and loose flannel shirts, her dark auburn hair tied back in a perpetual braid. Years ago, a car crash had taken her husband and left her with a permanent tremor in her right hand. Since then, she devoted her life to her bees, finding quiet in their order. Now, her eyes were bloodshot from crying. Her entire apiary had been destroyed 2 nights earlier. "Without pollination," she said, voice quaking, "the crops won't make it another season." Others chimed in, ranchers whose livestock had vanished, gardeners with nothing left to tend. Harold raised his voice over the din. "We've tried every method in the book. We either adapt or abandon. There's no third option." And then, in the corner, something moved. Eli Barnes. 10 sat silently beside his mother, sketchpad in hand. He had pale blonde hair that hung over his eyes and a small, delicate frame. Since the wildfire 2 years ago that had taken his father, Eli hadn't spoken a single word. The trauma had stolen his voice, leaving only silence and drawings. Today, he wasn't sketching raccoons or destruction like usual. Instead, he drew Ranger, his dog. Ranger, a 5-year-old German shepherd with sable and black fur and sharp amber eyes, lay curled at the boy's feet. The dog was muscular but lean, with an unmistakable air of discipline in every movement. He had been trained in search and rescue before being adopted by the Barnes family. Since the fire, Ranger had become Eli's constant companion and protector, responding to the boy's gestures as if they shared a language unspoken. Eli stood up, holding the sketch high in it. Ranger stood at the edge of a field, flanked by other dogs, a wall between the crops and the shadows. He pointed silently to the drawing, then down at Ranger. The room quieted. Sarah leaned forward, squinting. "You're suggesting what we use dogs?" Harold rubbed his chin. "Well, it's not the worst idea I've heard. But that's not pest control," someone scoffed from the back. "That's just a pet." "No," Harold said, his voice firmer now. "That's a trained shepherd, and maybe it's time we stop thinking like exterminators and start thinking like strategists." For a moment, no one spoke. Then Sarah stood. "Let's see what Ranger can do." That evening, as dusk folded over the island and the pine trees darkened into silhouettes, Harold, Sarah, and a few others followed Eli to the southern fields. A motion sensor had detected activity near the berry patches. Eli crouched beside Ranger, gave a soft, whistleless breath, and pointed toward the woods. The dog stiffened. A moment later, he took off, silent, focused. Seconds passed, then a loud ruckus, hissing, rustling, scattering when the group arrived. Ranger was standing tall on the ridge, ears up, tail steady. Beneath him, a trio of raccoons scurried back into the underbrush. The berries remained untouched. "That settles it," Harold said. "We're not just fighting pests anymore. We're enlisting allies." And so, the seed of a strange plan was planted, one that would change the island forever. The sun rose over whispering pines like a quiet promise. Dew clung to the tall grasses of the central meadow, sparkling in the orange light, while the sharp cries of gulls echoed distantly above the pine canopies. A soft wind rolled in from the west, stirring the salt air with the scent of earth and cedar. The island, once fraught with restless tension, now held its breath, suspended between chaos and something that felt like hope. At the edge of the old ferry dock, Harold Collins stood with a clipboard in hand, his denim jacket zipped against the breeze. His posture was straighter than usual, the limp in his leg more pronounced from standing too long. But his eyes were alive with energy. In front of him, a large transport van rolled to a stop, its logo, Northwest Canine Rescue Corps, gleaming across the side in navy blue. From the passenger seat stepped Major Rachel McCall, the lead trainer. She was in her mid-50s, compact in frame but commanding in presence. Her ash-blonde hair was cropped short beneath a field cap, and her eyes, gray and sharp as flint, surveyed her surroundings with military precision. Once an Air Force K-9 handler, McCall had spent decades training search and rescue dogs for everything from avalanches to hurricane zones. Now, she had brought her newest mission to Whispering Pines. 35 dogs, she said flatly, handing Harold a stack of papers, all trained. Some for scent tracking, some for perimeter defense. Most are German shepherds. 2 are Belgian Malinois, but they'll follow Ranger's lead. Ranger. already seated beside Eli on the dock, perked up at the sound of footsteps. His tail gave one deliberate thump. Eli, still silent but growing more confident, reached out and touched Ranger's ear with a gentle flick, a quiet sign of approval. The dogs were unloaded with care. Each one had a name, a temperament profile, and a specific strength. There was Thor, a broad-shouldered, sable-coated male with calm eyes, perfect for guarding livestock. Daisy, a black-furred female with a streak of white across her snout, quick-footed and sharp, ideal for fast patrols. And Boone, one of the two Malinois, lean and coiled like a spring, born for high-alert scenarios. The entire island gathered to watch. Children pointed and laughed. Elderly folks clapped softly. And Sarah Whitaker, standing near the edge of the field with a gentle smile, pressed a hand against her chest. After weeks of loss, she felt something stir, resilience. Each family volunteered to house one dog, pairing with them under McCall's guidance. Sarah was paired with Daisy. She's fast and observant. Like your bees, McCall said. Sarah chuckled, the comparison both accurate and oddly comforting. For the first time in a long time, she looked forward to rebuilding her apiary. A retired couple, the Gordons, were matched with Thor. The husband, Paul, was a tall, stoic man who rarely spoke, while his wife, Marlene, was lively and sharp-witted. Thor, in his quiet steadiness, was the perfect companion to balance them both. Ranger, now unofficially appointed as leader of the group, began establishing a rhythm. Each morning, Eli, still mute to most, drew up patrol routes on old paper maps, marking fields, livestock pens, and forest trails. Ranger seemed to understand the plans, moving with uncanny purpose from one section to another, often directing the other dogs with short barks or firm stares. Within a week, raccoon sightings dropped by half. Sarah's new beehives remained untouched. Fields, once torn up, were now green with cautious promise. The shepherds moved like shadows, present but unobtrusive, at night. The village square transformed into a communal campfire spot. Families gathered to share stories, dogs lying by their feet. Eli sat close to the flames with his sketchbook, carefully drawing each dog's face. He labeled them: Boone the Bold, Daisy the Swift, Thor the Stone, and of course, Ranger the General. And then, one night, something changed. Eli had stayed up later than usual. The fire had burned down to embers, and Sarah, noticing him lingering, knelt beside him. Time to head home. Sweetheart. Eli didn't respond. He stared at Ranger, who sat alert beside him, eyes reflecting the last flickers of flame. Sarah reached for his shoulder, and as she did, Eli opened his mouth. Ranger, he whispered. The sound was soft, just air and tremble, but Sarah froze. She turned, wide-eyed. Say that again, she asked. Eli looked up, uncertain. Ranger, he said. This time with more certainty. The word landed like a thunderclap in the quiet night. Sarah hugged him so tightly he dropped his sketchbook the next day. The entire island buzzed with the news. Eli Barnes had spoken, and he had done it for Ranger. Harold watched from a distance, arms crossed, as McCall approached him with a smile that cracked her normally stone expression. We call that, she said, a secondary rescue. The weeks that followed only strengthened the progress. With Eli's speech slowly returning, first words, then phrases, he began helping Rachel McCall directly in training exercises. He had a natural intuition with the dogs, something she described as quiet leadership. The raccoon population continued to fall back toward the coast. Many simply disappeared. Repelled by the organized canine patrols, locals began referring to Ranger as the Shepherd General, a title whispered with affection and awe. Children made flags with his face. Someone even carved a wooden statue that stood at the entrance of the island's central trailhead. Tourists hadn't returned yet, but a few curious journalists had begun making calls. And yet, amid the joy, there was humility. Sarah, fixing a bee-box with Daisy lounging nearby, remarked, "They didn't save the island because they were strong. They saved it because they were consistent. Like a heartbeat, morning came wrapped in mist, soft and slow, as if the island itself didn't want to wake." A week of gentle weather had lulled Whispering Pines into a quiet routine. The dogs continued their patrols. Families returned to their gardens, and the air buzzed again with cautious optimism. But under that fragile peace, something unseen was brewing. It started with Boone one morning. Boone, a lean Belgian Malinois known for his agility and alertness, missed his cue, normally the first to rise. The dog remained curled in his corner beside the porch of his handler. Elias Morrow, a retired forest ranger with dark eyes and a long, slow gait. Elias was a wiry man in his late 60s who spoke with the cadence of the woods, soft and steady. He'd lost his right hand to a logging accident in his 30s, and now relied on Boone not just as a partner, but as a limb of his daily life. Boone didn't move when Elias whistled. When he finally did rise, it was sluggish, like his limbs weighed twice as much. His eyes, normally alert and quick to track movement, seemed foggy. Elias chalked it up to fatigue. Perhaps the patrols had been too frequent. But then Thor began to stumble. Then Daisy, once swift and nimble, failed to respond when a squirrel darted past her. The dogs weren't just tired, they were losing their sharpness. Rachel McCall noticed it during the weekly drills. "These aren't isolated," she said to Harold, brows furrowed. "Something's affecting them all." Harold, now wearing a brace on his knee due to worsening arthritis, squinted at the training field. 4 of the dogs were lying down mid-exercise. Ranger, still steady and focused, barked once at Daisy, but she didn't move. "I don't like this," Harold muttered. "I don't either," McCall said, and I'm out of answers. That evening, under skies bruised with approaching rain, McCall made a call to the mainland. Dr. Madison Klein arrived 2 days later by ferry. She stepped off with a large steel crate of medical equipment and a look of brisk determination. A woman in her early 40s with deep brown skin, a short curly bob, and rectangular glasses that magnified her perceptive eyes. She exuded competence and caution. She wore a brown field jacket with patches from wildlife rescue teams across Oregon. Eli was among those who greeted her, silent but curious. Sketchpad in hand, Ranger stood protectively beside him, eyes locked on the stranger. As if already sensing the gravity she carried, Madison didn't waste time. She moved from house to house, collecting samples, testing saliva, swabbing paws, after 48 hours. Her results narrowed down a common thread. All the affected dogs had been patrolling the southeast sector of the island, near the marshy forest edge. "It's environmental," she explained at a town meeting. "And it's biological." She requested permission to lead an exploratory team into the forest. Harold agreed, but suggested a smaller group. "Take Eli," Sarah said suddenly. She stood in the back of the room, her braid damp from the mist outside. "He knows those woods better than most of us." Harold frowned. "He's just a boy. He's a boy who sees things we don't." She replied, "Trust me." And so, the next morning, under slate-gray skies and the occasional spatter of drizzle, Madison Klein and Eli Barnes set out with Ranger beside them. The boy had no words. only gestures and drawings, but that was more than enough. Madison quickly noticed how he paused at certain mossy stones or twisted roots, sketching symbols or shapes he recalled. His memory, she realized, was photographic, though each detail from previous patrols mapped in his mind. 3 miles in, near a clearing, soaked in stagnant water and rotting leaves. Ranger suddenly growled. Eli pointed toward a cluster of logs cloaked in fog. There, growing in thick bunches, were fungal blooms, pale and oddly luminous. Madison crouched, jackpot. The mushrooms were bioluminescent, casting a faint blue glow. She collected samples immediately. "My guess is mycotoxins," she said aloud, not expecting Eli to respond. "Airborne. Maybe absorbed through their paws. This place is loaded." Eli flipped his sketch pad and showed her a drawing, one he'd made days earlier, of those exact mushrooms glowing in the woods. He had seen them before anyone else. "You're my scout now." She smiled. They marked the entire area with warning flags and returned to the village by dusk. Madison ran her analysis late into the night. And by morning, she had confirmed it. The dogs were being slowly poisoned by exposure to a rare fungal species known as Mycoria sylvata, a spore-heavy mushroom that could affect the nervous systems of mammals. She announced her findings the next day, backed by detailed samples and reports. Harold nodded gravely. "So, what now? We quarantine the southeastern woods," Madison said. "And I recommend boot protection for the dogs. Their pads are absorbing it directly." McCall, already ahead of the curve, had ordered a set of specialized dog boots from a supplier she trusted. "They'll hate them at first," she said with a wry smile. "But they'll adjust as the islanders work together to clear and cordon off the infected zone." A new sense of unity emerged. Signs were painted and posted. The dogs were gradually introduced to their new gear. Eli helped lead the transition, showing each dog the boots, demonstrating with Ranger how to walk with them. Ranger, ever the leader, wore his with stoic dignity. The others followed. That week, the symptoms began to ease. Boone regained his speed. Daisy, her sharpness. The Shepherd Brigade was back in force at the evening campfire. Eli handed Madison a drawing, a detailed rendering of the mushroom field. "So you don't forget," he wrote in careful letters at the bottom. She framed it in her field journal. By mid-autumn, the leaves across whispering pines had turned gold and copper, carpeting the forest floor like a woven quilt of fire and memory. The mornings came cold and damp, the wind sharper now, pressing through window panes and pine branches alike, though the danger of the fungal outbreak had been contained. A deeper struggle had begun, one fought in silence. Patience and slow resilience, the cleanup effort, spearheaded by Dr. Madison Klein, and now formally organized through the island's newly formed Environmental Restoration Council, was in full motion. Every morning, teams of volunteers set out to carefully remove infected bark, trim diseased undergrowth, and burn affected logs in designated safe zones. It was meticulous work, draining and slow, and yet every islander, from young to old, found a role to play. At the heart of it all was Eli Barnes, once a silent shadow behind his sketchpad. Eli now stood confidently near the central shed, clipboard in hand, issuing task lists to adult volunteers and students alike. He wore a patched canvas vest with hand-drawn insignia, 2 shepherd dogs crossing paths beneath a pine tree, a gift from Sarah, who had sewn it herself. At just 11, Eli had been named assistant lead for Canine coordination, a title coined half seriously by Harold but respected without question. His voice, once lost in fire and grief, now carried clarity, soft but purposeful. His first full sentence in front of a crowd had been spoken just a week prior during a morning debrief. "Ranger says we clear north trails today." The villagers had laughed gently, not at him, but in delight at his connection to the dog they all saw as legend. Ranger, now approaching 6, had slowed. His once alert gait had softened, eyes slightly cloudier, and breathing shallower after each patrol. Still, every morning, he stood at the head of the line, tail swaying slightly as if counting every volunteer. He no longer sprinted, but he walked the whole perimeter, an old general reviewing the front. Eli noticed the limp first. Ranger's rear right leg trembled when standing too long, and at night he took longer to lie down. Dr. Klein confirmed mild spinal compression, nothing urgent, but time was moving. Eli didn't speak of it aloud, but his drawings changed. Ranger, once sketched mid-leap or leading others, was now drawn seated, noble, often under trees or beside Eli. Understanding his dog's time as lead was nearing its natural end. Eli approached Dr. Klein with a plan. "We need a rest place," he said, "for the ones who served." Thus was born the idea of the Haven Kennel, a rehabilitation and care shelter for aging service dogs. Dr. Klein secured grants through her university contacts, and McCall organized the construction logistics. A large weathered barn near the southern ridge was cleared, reinforced, and converted into a warm, ventilated home for the older dogs, complete with cushioned rest areas, supervised medical care, and even a rotating schedule of young volunteers to walk or simply sit beside them. But the chapter's true transformation came with the arrival of the Healing Trail program, a collaboration between Whispering Pines and a Portland-based special education institute, inspired by Eli's recovery. The program arranged for children with trauma or developmental disorders to visit and spend time working alongside the dogs and restoration teams. The first group arrived on a ferry mid-October, just as morning mist clung to the hills. Among them was Liam Tate, an 8-year-old with selective mutism and high sensory sensitivity. He was small and thin, with chestnut hair falling over one eye and hands that trembled when strangers approached. He didn't speak a word when disembarking, clutching a rubber fox toy and sticking close to his caseworker. But Ranger approached him gently. No bark, no pressure, just sat beside him, exhaling slow and steady. By lunchtime, Liam was resting his hand on the dog's neck, eyes calm. Eli watched from a distance, then came over, kneeling next to the boy. "This is Ranger." He said he doesn't talk either, not unless he has to. Liam didn't answer, but his fingers stilled their trembling. The Healing Trail became more than a program. It became a rhythm. The children, guided by Dr. Klein, McCall, and Eli, helped feed the dogs, collect leaves for composting, even paint signs along the trails. Sarah led beekeeping demos on sunny days, letting the kids taste honey right from the comb. Her smile had returned in full, and she often laughed with a lightness no one had seen since before the apiary fire. One day, Liam spoke, not to Eli, not to Sarah, but to Ranger. Just one word, soft and simple, "Stay." The entire room froze. Eli glanced at Dr. Klein, whose hand went to her chest. "He's breaking the surface," she whispered. Eli knelt beside the boy, handed him a pencil and paper. "Draw him," he said. Liam did. His sketch was crude but heartfelt. Ranger, lying beneath a tree, next to a small boy with a toy fox. At the bottom, Liam wrote, "Safe here, the forest, once a place of sickness, now rang with new life, The marshy eastern zones were drying thanks to a drainage system designed by 2 engineering students volunteering for a semester. Native ferns had begun to reappear, and songbirds returned in numbers not seen in years. Even the raccoons had adapted, now fewer and wilder. Retreating into deeper woods where they belonged, the island's children, both locals and visitors, formed a new unit called the Pine Watchers. Organized loosely under Eli's guidance, they patrolled in pairs with dogs, took notes, learned plant species, and shared journals. One girl, Maya Ruiz, 12 from Bend, Oregon, painted a mural on the west side of the Haven Kennel. It depicted dogs standing alongside children beneath tall whispering pines, sunlight streaming through a break in the clouds. Under that mural, Ranger lay each afternoon, his breaths deep and slow, eyes half closed. He had earned his rest one evening, as twilight turned the world blue. Eli sat beside Ranger outside the kennel. The boy held a pencil but didn't draw. He simply rested his head against the dog's shoulder. "You're still leading," he whispered. "Just quietly now." The sky above Whispering Pines was painted with the soft strokes of an autumn evening, burnt orange at the horizon, fading into dusky violet. The wind came in from the sea, cool but gentle, stirring the pines with a whisper that had given the island its name, beneath their swaying limbs, near the heart of the meadow. People had gathered in quiet reverence. It had been 8 years since the first dogs had come ashore. 8 years since Ranger changed everything. Now, he lay in Eli's arms. Ranger, at 14, was frail. His sable and black coat had turned silver around the muzzle and ears. His breaths were shallow, spaced wide, but his posture remained noble, his gaze unwavering. He rested his head in Eli's lap, eyes closing slowly as if accepting, not surrendering. Eli Barnes, now 19, had grown tall and steady, his once shy presence replaced by a calm, grounding energy. His voice, though still soft, carried across rooms with clarity. Today, he wore a dark gray sweater and weathered boots, his shepherd vest still stitched with the same emblem. 2 dogs crossing beneath a pine tree. He had spent years studying animal behavior, working with therapy animals, and recently giving a TEDx talk titled Healing Through Animals, The Language We Forgot. It had gone viral. Around them stood familiar faces. Sarah Whitaker, now in her 50s, had a few strands of silver in her braid, but the same fierce kindness in her eyes. She ran a successful bee education program on the island, teaching ecology to children from across the country. She stood beside Daisy, her shepherd companion, now old but still watchful, Dr. Madison Klein. Still stationed part-time on the island, had earned multiple awards for her work in environmental rehabilitation. She stood with her arms crossed, trying and failing to hide the tears in her eyes. McCall had long since retired from field work, but she returned each summer to train new handlers at the sanctuary. Today, she wore her field cap in Ranger's honor, her salute crisp and silent, and there, among them, were dozens of children, some now teenagers, who had once come to Whispering Pines broken and left whole. They had traveled from Oregon, California, even Arizona to say goodbye. At their feet lay dogs, some elderly, some still in training, each one calm, grounded, as if they too understood. The final breath came as the sun touched the horizon. Ranger exhaled once, deeply, and then was still. Eli didn't cry at first. He only held the dog closer, his fingers resting gently on the old shepherd's ribs. Then, without looking up, he whispered, "You led us, even when we didn't know where we were going." the next day. Whispering Pines unveiled a bronze statue at the center of the village. It showed Ranger standing alert beneath a pine tree, his gaze fixed forward. At the base, the inscription read, "He taught us to listen without words." The dedication ceremony was attended by over 300 people, including researchers, educators, environmentalists, and children who had once been part of the Healing Trail program. The event was broadcast live. The story of a dog who healed a community told to the world once more. In the years since the forest restoration, the island had transformed. What had begun as an emergency measure to control an ecological crisis had become an international case study in interspecies cooperation. Whispering Pines was now home to the Shepherd Sanctuary, a facility founded and directed by Eli Barnes. It operated as both a rehabilitation center for senior working dogs and a retreat for children dealing with trauma, grief, or developmental challenges. The sanctuary's design was simple but elegant. Low wooden buildings tucked into the trees, each with large windows and soft light. Dogs roamed freely between the structures, always under the quiet guidance of their human companions. Trails wound through the forest, now clear and healthy, with signs hand-painted by children describing native species and encouraging respect for the land. Veterinary interns rotated through from top schools. Behavioral scientists came to observe. Parents arrived with children for week-long healing sessions. Whispering Pines had become more than an island. It was a philosophy. One morning, as fog crept in from the cliffs, Eli stood in the meadow where he had once walked beside Ranger. At his side was a new companion, Holly, a young German shepherd with a soft amber coat and eager energy. She was not a replacement. Ranger could never be replaced. But she was part of the next chapter. A boy approached, no older than 8, with copper-red curls and wide, anxious eyes. He clutched a small notebook to his chest. "Mr. Eli," the boy asked, voice trembling, Can I help feed them?" Eli knelt, smiling. "Of course, they've been waiting for you," as they walked together, Holly leading the way. The wind picked up slightly, rustling the tall pines. Eli closed his eyes for a moment, in the hush between gusts. He thought he heard it, a faint bark in the distance, familiar and strong, a sound not of grief, but of guidance. Ranger had not left. He had become part of the land, part of the legacy, and the shepherds would continue, sometimes. The greatest miracles come not with thunder or fire, but on quiet pause, in the gentle gaze of a dog, or the soft voice of a child rediscovering their courage. Ranger's story is not just about a dog, it is about healing, about second chances, and about the quiet power of love when shared across species, generations, and wounds both seen and unseen. Many would call it coincidence. But here on Whispering Pines, we know better. We saw hearts healed, lives renewed, and hope restored, not by force, but through patience, loyalty, and grace. And perhaps, just perhaps, it was God who sent Ranger when the island needed more than a solution. It needed faith. If this story touched you, please share it with someone who needs hope. Comment below what part moved you most. And if you believe in healing and in God's unseen hand, type Amen in the comments to stand with us in gratitude. Subscribe to this channel for more true stories of love, redemption, and quiet miracles, and may God bless you and guide your path, just as He guided Ranger.